Welcome to CIPS Level 2, Certificate in Procurement and Supply Operations, Module 1, Introducing Procurement and Supply, Learning Outcome 5, which is to understand the need for the effective and efficient administration of purchases that are made within external suppliers. So let's introduce you to the following key terms. Administration. This is managing resources, including people and processes, and distributing relevant information effectively. Administrative roles include receptionists, data entry clerks, expediters, and personal assistants. Without effective administration, an organisation will not be cost effective. Within procurement, administrators can assist with tasks, including placing orders, arranging supplier reviews, and monitoring KPIs. Efficiency, performing a task competently with the least amount of waste in the shortest amount of time. And if you recall back to a previous session, the 5S framework and applying lean thinking can be used to improve efficiency. And then effectiveness, the degree to which tasks are carried out and how associated problems are solved. Unlike efficiency, it's not usually measured with reference to cost. We're now going to look at the various elements that make up a contract or agreement with a supplier, paying particular attention to the role of expressed and implied terms. So a contract is legally binding and it exists in every commercial transaction. And it tells the procurement professional and their suppliers what should happen, when and where, and what, when and how payment is required. And for a simple contract or legal agreement to exist, there has to be both an offer and an acceptance, which forms an agreement. This is where both sides have discussed what will be in the contract and what they've agreed to do. If this hasn't occurred, a contract cannot be made. This agreement will be underpinned by something called consideration, and this is the bargaining or exchange aspect of a contract. Something for something. It's a promise on one part for an act on another. So consideration for the sale of a car would be the amount offered. You also need intention, which is where all parties must have the intention that their agreement can be enforced by law. So if something goes wrong, one party can take legal action against the other. If either side is not willing to be exposed to this, again, a contract can't be made. And in addition to the signing parties, they must have something known as capacity. This is where you're over a legal age for a particular country, or it could mean not suffering from a mental disorder where you're not in your own state of mind, including being drunk or under the influence of drugs. So to recap, you need an offer and acceptance, consideration, intention, and capacity. Within these contracts, you will have expressed and implied terms. So an expressed term is clearly written. It will be something like the price, the quality, the lead times. Implied terms, unfortunately, are not always written into the contract, but they are assumed to exist by virtue of their legalities and regulations. So it could be something like making sure that a product is safe to consume, which may not have been written explicitly in the contract, but it's certainly a law against anything other than that. So think about some times when you've entered into a contract yourself, maybe in your personal life with a mobile phone provider or an electricity supplier, or when making an online purchase, or at work, it could be an employment contract. You may also have negotiated and raised contracts in the course of your role. So have a think about some of the things you've done in your time and identify the intention, the consideration, the offer and the acceptance. How often have you just signed a contract without reading the terms and conditions? And what are the potential risks around signing a contract without reading as a buyer? Maybe you're exposing your organisation to risk, not noticing if the other party has changed the terms and conditions. Now, a need or requirement can be identified by anybody in an organisation. But once that need's identified, a requisition should be raised. And that would state what and how much is required, and when and where it's to be delivered. This is helping a buyer to understand those 5 rights. Requisitions can be created manually, electronically, or using an MRP system, which stands for Materials Requirement Planning. The buyer will then review the requisition and liaise with colleagues to check the requirements. Manual requisitions usually require more investigation than electronic ones prior to orders being placed. And the benefits of raising them electronically is that all fields must be complete before the requisition is raised, and only authorised personnel can actually raise the requisition. They need to be approved by authorised personnel before they reach procurement. But buyers will check the customer has authority to identify that need. They'll also check that the need is actually required, so the person who raised the requisition might not be aware that there is plenty of that item already in inventory, or the items may be discontinued. Check the requested date of the item. What impact could this have? If the item's not needed until later, procurement have more options, or might be able to access a cheaper alternative than if needed to react at short notice. Check the amount stated on the requisition is correct and the cost centre that will be charged. Have a look at the diagram on this slide because I'm introducing you to the tendering process in broad terms. And we'll go into detail at each stage, addressing all the key items. So the first stage is prepare. This is the creation of requisitions and requirements. At this point as well, we would develop a specification. Key performance indicators and the contract terms would be created to enable us to provide suppliers with information about what they need to supply, when and how. Then the process, the request for quotes. Maybe that's one thing you're going to do. So you use this to explore the commercial offering from a current or prospective supplier within your marketplace. Or it could be an invitation to tender that is sent to potential suppliers as an offer to them to supply goods or services to your organisation. And you'd commonly use an invitation to tender for high value or long-term contracts, or where there are many suppliers to select. Tenders can either be open or restricted. Open means that any supplier is able to submit a response to that tender document, but a restricted one requires suppliers to be selected and evaluated prior to inviting them to submit a response. And you do this using something called a PQQ, which stands for a pre-qualification questionnaire, which asks for information on the supplier's financial history, compliance to regulations, quality processes and procedures, sustainability and environmental policies, which helps the buyer to make an informed decision about who to work with. Much of this is covered by Carter's 10 Cs. A quote is then submitted by the supplier in response to an RFQ, or a tender is submitted by a supplier in response to an invitation to tender. Regardless of the method you use, suppliers must meet the deadline in order to be considered. And those quotes and tenders should be opened at the same time. The documents must contain all the information requested in the tender or the quote, and should be clearly stated and unambiguous, so the buyer can assess which prices are most competitive, and more importantly, which suggests the best value for money. The evaluate phase is the assessment of the quotes and the tenders from the suppliers. You need to check that all the details are as per the specification, using Carter's 10 Cs to impartially assess the tenders and quotes, remembering no extra marks are awarded for exceeding a specification. And then the award stage. In some cases, the buyer can award contracts directly. In other cases, they will need approval from an authorised person, like a manager, before awarding the contract. Purchase orders are generated in response to a quotation, and the tender award documents are generated in response to a tender. Once signed, it's difficult to make amendments to the contract. Order acknowledgements are documents produced and sent by the supplier to the buyer to confirm receipt of a purchase order. And delivery notes, as you can see on the screen, documents produced and sent by the supplier which accompany their delivery to the buying organisation. So let's look at some of these numbers on the screen. Number 1, the supplying organisation. Number 2, the buying organisation. Where does it need to be shipped to? The customer, the consumer. Number 3, the date the goods were shipped. Number 4, the buying organisation's order number. Number 5, tracking details for the order. Number 6, details of the carrier or haulage organisation or the vehicle reference. Number 7, date the goods were dispatched. Number 8, the quantity. 9, identification of parts. Number 10, the part code. And finally, the description. I'm now going to outline the invoice approval process. So invoices are sent after goods have been dispatched or delivered, sent electronically or by the post. You check to ensure they match the purchase order and the delivery note. If everything matches, then the invoice can be passed to the accounting department for payment. If a variance is found, it needs to be investigated and resolved before the invoice is paid. Budgets, requisitions, orders and tenders need to be authorised by an appropriate person, either verbally, signature on a paper copy, via an electronic approval system. But what details does an authorisation need to check? And why do these documents need to be authorised? It's to ensure that any expenditure is necessary. The different roles within procurement will have different responsibilities, and this is known as the separation of duties. Buyers are responsible for receiving the identification of need and sourcing the products or services, selecting suppliers, sending tenders and quotes, and negotiating the contracts. The supplier relationship managers are responsible for developing and maintaining supplier relationships. They work closely with strategic suppliers that have been allocated to ensure a mutually beneficial relationship. Quality control workers are responsible for conducting checks on products coming into the warehouse to make sure they're fit for purpose or as per the purchase order and specifications. Now, for tenders, which are often complex, several stakeholders should be involved in deciding which supplier should be awarded the contract. Contract recommendation is a panel agreement for which suppliers should win the business, with justification for why that supplier was selected. And the authorisation is signing an agreement or a contract by an individual with authority or capacity. In the public sector, it's common for buyers to have an authority in place. They can send out RFQs or award tenders up to a certain amount, but above that amount, the buyer have to get authority from people higher up the chain. And thresholds exist within the public sector, which dictate the maximum amount each contract can cost. And if the cost is expected to go above the threshold, it must be published externally. Now, the efficient approval processes are important throughout procurement. If approval is not granted effectively and efficiently, a need could go unmet. And this could result in a production organisation being unable to manufacture goods and services and being unable to deliver its contracts. Thanks for watching.